Hello all, Greg Riesninger here from HMGS Hobby University and Wicked Elf Miniatures, talking about wet pellets. I'm finding a lot more people are using a wet palette, especially at HMGS events, and I just want to talk about it just so everyone gets familiar with the subject. Whether you use a wet palette that's made specifically for the wet palette, or if you're using Tupperware or any other flat bottom plastic container, there's some things we want to be aware when we're working with wet palettes. All wet palettes will contain something of the foam on a nice flat bottom. That's actually to make sure that our paint stays nice, flat, and level. And then some kind of paper, such as parchment paper or their own proprietary paper type, so that way we can work with it that way. Nicer wet palettes, such as the ones designed for it, may have other compartments or other containers built into it, or other latches and seals to make sure it's not going anywhere, keeping things secure. If you're making your own wet palette, Tupperware or such, what we want to make sure is that we have a nice flat bottom so it doesn't rock or slide and hold your paint level. And we also want a flat top as well. You can find that in sandwich holders for Tupperwares. That way it doesn't drip, your paint, water doesn't condensate onto here and drip it into your paint. Almost every wet palette will use foam or a sponge of some type. I really prefer the wet palettes. I use a foam. I find it easier to clean them up. If it includes a sponge of some type, I really prefer them to be white over a color. When you're looking at your paper and your paint through a colored filter, such as a yellow sponge, it can throw you off a little bit. My personal preference is I actually use paper towels. The color of them I can choose what I want to it, and I can always cut them down to size what I need. And then I use a little bit of extra that I have other paper towels to actually clean my brush with. What we're going to do is we're going to get this good and soaked. Now we don't want it so wet that there's a huge amount, but we also want to make sure there's no air bubbles underneath our foam or in this case our paper towel. And we want enough water that the paper is going to come in full contact with the water source. The sponge is really just acting as a reserve to help hold that water to it, but we do want enough of a level that the paper actually holds to the paint. So what we're going to do here is we're going to take our paper, and it's going to tend to curl when I put it down, especially this parchment paper. I'm going to put the parchment paper down, make sure it's making good full contact with it, and making sure it's touching the sides. I'm using the paint bottles to help hold down the paper. Otherwise, it has a tendency to curl when it first comes on in. I tend to find the Reynolds Kitchen Cooking Baking Sheets easiest to do. They come as pre-cut sheets. Also, they're folded over, so I just cut off the edges of them, and they fit most of my wet palettes just to start with. So for every one cookie sheet I get 4 wet palette sheets. Depending on how OCD I'm in a particular day, I may just spend some time getting the bubbles out from underneath of it, because that's a spot where it's not going to help bring paint water to my paint. The sheet I could have cut down just a little bit, but it will do for our demonstration purposes. And on this now I can put on any paint I want to. There's enough water on here when I'm trying to move it. I can actually slide it around a little bit, but not so much that it's poking, or if I touch the edges of it, that's going to flood into my palette. If you overwater it, what happens is you're going to see as you touch this edge, it gets lower than a sponge, you're going to have water run onto your wet palette. Or if you actually start seeing poor spots of contact where it's not, the water's not touching the paper, that's going to be spots where your paint's going to dry quicker just because it's not making contact with the water. Just some basic things to watch out for. As you touch your palette, make sure you're getting all these little spots of water off your palette. Those are just spots where if you put your paint at, what happens is you're going to paint's going to go running and watery. I do occasionally like to keep a spot like that on my paper, and specifically just for me to grab a little clean water from when I'm thinning out my paints, but that's really up to your preference. So I hope this helps, and I hope this is a good way for us to get familiar with the wet palette. If you have any questions, please contact me through our Facebook page, or if you want to, we can more discuss it at a Hobby University class. Thank you very much. Have a great evening. Bye.